right. If I get 10 viewers, I'll do an article review. I need 10 views. All right. If I get 10 viewers, I'll do this article review. And the article will be this article here. Oh, I'm at 7. All I need is 10 viewers and I'll do this. I'll do this article review just for fun. Sunday night, let's review this article. Oh, I've got 11 viewers. All right, time to do it. So let's discuss this article just for fun. Ventilatory variables and mechanical power in patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome. Now, I have read this article, but I have not practiced this article review. This is not a structured journal club or anything like that. So yeah, let's just casually go through this article. And if anyone has any comments, then please post them in the chat. I'm streaming this live to the Facebook channel, my YouTube channel, as well as Twitch. So you can view on any one of those. If you want to change out from Facebook, I've already lost 4 viewers, so I'm down to 6 now. I said I would need 10 to do this review. How about this? If someone puts in the chat that they want to watch me review this article right now, I will be more than happy to do it. But maybe I should see if anybody actually has the time to sit and listen to it. Mind you, I am recording it, so. Well, I got a like there, so maybe somebody wants me to go through it. Maybe I'll wait for at least one comment to say, go for it. All right. Who wants me to go through this article? Anybody have the time to sit and watch? I won't take too long going through it. I'll do a speedy review. All right. Angela wants me to do it. Great. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put up this little ticker at the bottom, which will, it's the PMID. So if anybody wants to find this article, I will apologize. It is not open access. The article is not an open access article. So you can probably just find the abstract online. But if you Google PMID 33784486, it's going along the bottom of the screen there, then you will be able to find this article. All right. So let's discuss ventilatory variables and mechanical power in patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome. The first author is Eduardo Costa, and there's a lot of familiar names here. Ards is a physician and researcher from St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. Dr. Laurent Bouchard, well, I think they're all doctors, but maybe I won't bother saying doctor for everybody. Laurent Bouchard is also at St. Michael's Hospital. He's also one of my current bosses on my part-time employment. Roy Brauer has been heavily involved with ArdsNet studies. He's one of the, I think he was the first author on the high versus low PEEP table from ArdsNet. Cavalcanti was one of the authors of the ART trial. Alain Marcat was I think he was the second author or the first author for the Express trial, which is a sort of higher PEEP versus lower PEEP study, although it was a different method for setting high PEEP. He did that study with Laurent. Maureen Mead was the author of the Loves trial. So basically, the reason why a lot of these people were involved, I'm not going to go through the rest of the names, but I guess the senior author is Marcelo Amato, who published the driving pressure paper from New England Journal of Medicine in 2015, or in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015. Now, the reason why a lot of these authors are there is because they were authors of high versus low PEEP studies, basically ARDS studies. So not necessarily just looking at high versus low PEEP, but looking at ARDS studies in general. And this study was essentially the objectives of the study. Well, let's start with the rationale. Mortality in ARDS has decreased after the adoption of lung protective strategies. Lower tidal volume, lower driving pressure, lower respiratory rates, and higher end expiratory pressure have all been suggested as key components of lung protection strategy. A unifying theoretical explanation has been proposed that attributes lung injury to the energy transfer rate, which is mechanical power, from the ventilator to the patient, calculated from a combination of several ventilator variables. So, their objective of this study was to assess the impact of mechanical power on mortality in patients with ARDS as compared with that of primary ventilator variables such as driving pressure, tidal volume, and respiratory rate. So, what this means is mechanical power is something that's growing in the literature recently. However, it's a complicated equation. Of course, you can get online calculators or Excel spreadsheets that plug out all the information for you, but it's much more complicated than something such as driving pressure, which is just plateau minus PEEP. Of course, tidal volume is extremely simple, as is respiratory rate. So the methods is they obtain data on ventilatory variables and mechanical power from a pooled database of patients with ARDS, and this is where all these authors come into play. So they basically used data from their studies. They had 6 randomized control trials of protective mechanical ventilation and 1 large observational cohort of patients with ARDS. The primary outcome was mortality at 28 days or 60 days. The measurements and main results, they included 4,549 patients. The average mechanical power was this value here, 0.32 joules per minute per kilogram of predicted body weight. The driving pressure was 15 plus or minus 5.8. This is just the range of values. And the respiratory rate was 25.7 plus or minus 7.4 breaths per minute. The driving pressure, respiratory rate, and mechanical power were significant predictors of mortality in an adjusted analysis. I'll talk about that later. And the impact of the driving pressure on mortality was 4 times as large as that of respiratory rate. So this is important because it says that driving pressure, respiratory rate, and mechanical power were the significant predictors of mortality. So these were the things really to look out for. However, driving pressure was 4 times larger than that of respiratory rate in terms of its impact on mortality. So in conclusion, mechanical power was associated with mortality during controlled mechanical ventilation in ARDS, but a simpler model of using only the driving pressure and respiratory rate was equivalent. Now, you can find this information online by Googling PMID, the PMID number that's at the bottom there. So if you literally just typed PMID 33784486 in a browser, you will find this paper abstract. However, it is not open access, and I apologize. So we'll look back and look at this at a glance, or at least we can start here, and then we'll come back to the what does this study add to the field? We'll do that at the end. But the scientific knowledge on the subject, lung protective strategies for ARDS, are based on lower tidal volume, lower driving pressure, limited plateau pressure, limited respiratory rates, and enough end expiratory pressure. Basically, that means sufficient PEEP or hopefully an appropriate level of PEEP. Mechanical power has been promulgated as a unifying theoretical explanation that lumps all of these variables into one measure of energy transferred from the ventilator to the respiratory system. In this theoretical construct, this transferred energy would be the cause of ventilator-induced lung injury. It remains unclear which ventilator settings composing the mechanical power derived from a mechanical ventilator to a patient with ARDS are associated with mortality, or how the predictive values of these settings compare with those of mechanical power. So, I mentioned in the abstract, they used a database of over 4,000 patients from 6 randomized controlled trials and 1 very large observational cohort. Now, usually I look at the supplemental data, but when I tried to get access to the supplemental data, it was not letting me access it through my proxy, which is what I use to access this paper, but it would not let me access the supplemental data. So that was kind of a pain in the butt because I wanted to look specifically at the trials. Having said that, I can see the references are here. So if I click on this, it should bring me to the end. And here we have Brauer. This is the ArdsNet study, high versus low PEEP. Mercat. This was the Express trial. This also would have had Laurent Burchard in there. Maureen Mead. This is the Love study, as I mentioned. 18. This is the ART trial, as I mentioned. And 14 must be the large observational cohort evaluation of a ventilator strategy to prevent barotrauma. So that is, yes, this is an observational study. Okay. So yeah, those are the studies. Now back to the manuscript. All right. So they looked at the studies. They included only patients under controlled mechanical ventilation to assess the effect of set respiratory rates on mortality, because measurement of plateau are different to interpret in spontaneous breathing patients. To this end, patients ventilated in pressure support mode or those whose respiratory rates exceeded the set respiratory rate in an assist control mode were excluded. So, if they really want to know the effect of ventilatory variables, you want to ignore the fact that patients that are breathing may contribute to either lowering or increasing their risk for lung injury. So, it's an important strategy that they excluded patients that were on pressure support because this would imply that they are spontaneously breathing. And then they also excluded patients in which the documented total respiratory rate was higher than the set respiratory rate. Of course, there could be possible situations where the patient was perhaps triggering some of the breath, but the total rate equaled the set rate. But this is a very good way to eliminate some of that noise that could be introduced by including patients who are breathing spontaneous. Some of the other elements here in this introduction, again, kind of repeating that lung protective strategies include a number of things that have been proposed in the literature: low tidal volume, plateau pressure, or higher PEEP, perhaps. One potential important variable that has not been directly studied in randomized trials is that of the respiratory rate. And it says studies in experimental models suggest that an increased respiratory rate worsens ventilator induced lung injury, but the relative contribution of the respiratory rate versus the other factors is unknown. This is an important issue because clinicians often face the dilemma of optimizing the ventilatory strategy when one component negatively affects another component of lung protection. For example, decreasing driving pressure may require higher respiratory rates in order to maintain adequate CO2 removal, with unknown net consequences on clinical outcomes. This line right here actually summarizes what this paper provides overall, which I'll get to. But this sentence really does hammer home because if we're trying to reduce driving pressure and we're doing it through lowering tidal volume, we know that to maintain minute ventilation, you have to increase respiratory rate. So the question is, does the increasing respiratory rate, does that harm outweigh the benefits of lowering the driving pressure? And they actually provide a nice graph looking at isocapnic conditions, meaning trying to maintain the same CO2. They give condition examples where it would be harmful to do it and those in which it would be beneficial to do it in terms of trading off driving pressure and respiratory rate. So, unifying theoretical explanation has recently been proposed that could address these trade offs on the basis of basic thermodynamic principles. Again, this is talking about the mechanical power. Mathematically, the mechanical power is the integral of the area under the airway pressure versus the tidal volume plots multiplied by the respiratory rate, and it's given by the following equation. Like, tell me this is not something that it would be hard to explain at the bedside. There's a better way that this is described further in the manuscript, which I'll jump ahead just now to the next page. So, mechanical power was obtained as the algebraic sum of three components. So, really, they're trying to look at the amount of power basically applied to the lung through static power related to PEEP. So when you increase PEEP, of course, they're suggesting that you are transferring some of that energy to the lungs. So there's injury related to the elastic or static power related to PEEP. There's the elastic dynamic power related to driving pressure. So this is the pushing in and out of the volume and pressure into the lung. Then there's the resistive power, which is combination of ventilator circuit, endotracheal tube, airway resistance, etc. Now, obviously, the endotracheal tube resistance is not reaching the lungs, so this may be hard to determine. But these three components really make up the mechanical power as a total. So, in terms of what they did, this is again the whole list of patients that they found. This is not really. Probably don't need to review all of this stuff here. For every patient, they obtain the age, sex, and adjusted risk of death on the basis of the Apache 2 score, which is acute physiology and chronic health evaluation, the SAPS score, which is a simplified acute physiology score 2 and 3, so SAPS 2 and 3, values of pH, PF ratio, PaCO2, respiratory system compliance, PEEP tidal volume. They were all based on average values for the first 24 hours after randomization to the trial. And yeah, okay, so I already discussed mechanical power. The outcomes they were looking at were 60-day mortality, except in one of the cohorts, which was the Ards trial, which included over 1,000 patients. They only had data from 28-day mortality was available. They did a whole bunch of statistical analyses here. They looked at confounders, including PF ratio, PaCO2, pH, respiratory system compliance, and ventilatory ratio, which is an indication of dead space fraction, as continuous variables and two categorical dummy variables, one representing study trial and another representing study arm. Basically, they're just describing all the things they tried to use as adjustments to ensure that they're eliminating or trying to balance out any confounders so that the results that they are determining are not affected by these confounders, which are very important confounders, like, for example, how severe their blood gas exchange is already, and whether there's a presence of dead space. And this is just a simple way of determining how bad someone's dead space might be, the ventilatory ratio. So, in addition, they divided the whole population into quintiles of driving pressure, tidal volume, respiratory rate, or power. They assessed the association between belonging to a given quintile and mortality in a model adjusted at the baseline risk model. This is all the wording that gets very complicated. So I'm going to skip ahead here to the isocapnic curves because this is one of the graphs that I'm going to share and discuss probably in more detail. To illustrate the trade offs between the risks associated with changes in respiratory rate and driving pressure. So I mentioned before that if you lower tidal volume to lower your driving pressure, but you have to increase your rate, how do you balance the risks of each? Like, is it an overall net benefit or an overall net harm? So they computed the risk of death at each combination of the respiratory rate and driving pressure acquired to maintain the same PaCO2, which is what they call the isocapnic curves. The theoretical curves represent a situation in which one attempts to reduce the tidal volume and consequently the driving pressure at the expense of increasing the respiratory rate to maintain the alveolar ventilation at a constant value. Good question, Troy. Is my microphone cutting out frequently, or is it just Troy? Anybody else that's been listening want to chime in? I did connect a new microphone today, actually. I decided to buy a microphone I owned years ago, so I hope it's not the microphone. That would really suck. Anybody want to? Anyone that's been listening a little? Well, crap. That really sucks. Anyone else not having a problem with audio? That's really unfortunate if that's the case. Yes, cutting out just a bit. Is it really loud? Is that why? Like maybe it's clipping? I don't. That's unfortunate. What do I do? Now it could be my internet. Maybe it's not just my microphone. It's not loud. Okay, that's good. It's cutting off and on. Gets very quiet frequently and then back to normal. Okay, let me see. I can try turning off echo cancellation. Okay, let me. I just muted myself. Okay, does that sound any different right now? Looks like I somehow muted myself just a second ago. I turned off echo cancellation, but I can't tell what it sounds like to you guys. So if you're saying it gets very quiet and frequently, then back to normal, I'm assuming it's trying to process something that may not be necessary. No change. All right. Let me. You know what? There is some software that this microphone uses. I'll see about turning it off. 1 second. Okay, I've turned off the software. Melanie's saying sounds good. I've turned off the software. I probably don't sound as professional right now, but maybe it sounds just fine. Is there any difference now in what the microphone seems to be doing? Perfect. Okay, that sounds better then? Does that seem to sound different than like, does that seem okay, sounds better? Okay. So that was probably a problem. My software was trying to do things and my microphone was trying to do something else. So I will leave this setting off, and if everything sounds better now, I will continue. All right. Thanks everybody for letting me know. I'd rather I'd rather know sooner than way later. All right. So if we're happy with how it sounds, then I will, yes, I'll continue. Okay. Thanks. All right. So where was I? I was talking about the isocapnic curves. Um, all right. Yeah. I think that's where I was at the isocapnic curves. So I'll just continue here in case I don't think I'd gone farther. So they're basically looking at, so they had theoretical curves to represent a situation in which one attempts to reduce the tidal volume, which would reduce driving pressure, as I mentioned, at the expense of increasing respiratory rate to maintain the ventilation at a constant value. So specifically, alveolar ventilation was kept at the average value of our sample for varying values of the respiratory rate, anywhere from 15 up to 45 breaths per minute, a range that encompasses approximately 90% of the respiratory rates in the data set. For simplicity, we assumed an airway dead space of 1.5 mils per kilogram of predicted body weight, and an alveolar dead space of 20% of the tidal volume. Subsequently, we performed a sensitivity analysis examining the effects of larger airway dead space and larger alveolar dead spaces as well. The driving pressure resulting from each computed tidal volume was calculated by assuming that the respiratory system compliance did not vary with the respiratory rate and that there was no intrinsic PEEP. Isocapnic curves were computed at varying levels of respiratory system compliance, ranging anywhere from 0.14 to 0.86 mils per centimeter of water per kilogram of predicted body weight, corresponding to compliances of 10 and 60 mils per centimeter water for patients with a predicted body weight of 70 kilograms. So this is just an average predicted body weight. The risk of death was computed from the driving pressure and respiratory rate obtained at each point along the curve using the effect sizes of the driving pressure and respiratory rate obtained in the multivariable model of mortality. Now, rather than read all of the results, I'd like to go to the graphs because the graphs really visually display this quite nicely. So what they wanted to do, again, was look at all of the singular variables of mechanical power and see individually what type of impact do they have on mortality. So this is a forest plot. For those who are not familiar with forest plots, this is a forest plot that's looking at odds ratios. Some forest plots might look at risk reduction or relative risk, but this is looking at odds ratio. So if the odds land or cross 1, that means there is really no significant difference in your odds of, what is it, death. So they're looking here, it's a forest plot of the odds ratios for death relative to the population average after adjustment for several covariates. So again, I mentioned they were looking at adjusting for confounding variables. So it was related to whether or not it had to do with the trial they were in, the study arm they were in, respiratory system compliance, ventilatory ratio, which is basically dead space, arterial pH, PaCO2, and PF ratio in the base model. So what they found is that, so again, for reading these forest plots, if it crosses 1, means there's really no significant difference between, basically there's no increased odds ratio, I should say, for in this example. Whereas if it's above 1 and the entire range is above 1, this means this is a significant difference in your odds of death based on respiratory rate. So respiratory rate can predict, so these are tested predictors, can predict your outcome. So respiratory rate, yes. Tidal volume, no. And this is interesting and actually supports the driving pressure paper from 2015, where they showed that different levels of tidal volume, different levels of plateau pressure even didn't matter provided you had the same driving pressure. So if you had the same driving pressure, tidal volume didn't matter. If you had the same driving pressure but different plateau pressures, again, it didn't matter about the plateau pressure. It all came down to the driving pressure. So as you can see, tidal volume there's no significant difference in your odds ratio of mortality. PEEP, no difference. Plateau pressure, no difference. But respiratory rate and driving pressure, as you can see, driving pressure was even more significant, increased your odds ratio of poor outcomes. So when they looked at power, total power, also is a predictor of poor outcomes, again, predictive of death in this model here. And then when they looked at the separate power components, again, I remember I mentioned ones related to driving pressure, which is that dynamic power, static related to PEEP, and resistive. Resistive had no bearing on it. The static related to PEEP, also not significant, but the dynamic, again, the component of power related to driving pressure was significantly associated with an increased odds ratio of death. Now, this one was interesting. They've discovered that driving pressure, as I mentioned this earlier, was 4 times higher the risk than respiratory rate. So what they did is they took these values. They said, okay, well, let's take driving pressure times 4 and add respiratory rate just to get a value. Again, the thing with power is like joules per liter per kilo. And, it's, let me go back up so I don't mess that up. Actually, I think it's right. No, that's here. Where is it? There we go. Joules per minute per kilogram. Before I continue, Troy is saying, so the resistive power looked at peak pressure. Yes, peak minus plateau. Yeah, so if you go to the original equation, so let's look at the full equation. The full equation for power has this peak minus plateau component right here. So that would be the resistive power. There's just your driving pressure. This is your PEEP, right? And then you've got respiratory rate and tidal volume as well. So, and when you look at the separated components, you've got peak minus plateau as the resistive pressure. So all of them have this 0.98 times respiratory rate. This one is just multiplied by PEEP. This one's multiplied by half the driving pressure. And this one is multiplied by peak minus plateau. So they took this 4 times driving pressure plus respiratory rate to give a value. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that you're looking for a specific value to know if this is bad, for example. And it's the same with power. Obviously, the higher something is, probably the worse outcome you're going to have. But the question is, if you make a change on the ventilator, you want to know, does that number move? Okay, does it go higher or does it get lower? So if lower is better, anything you do, you hope is going to have a net result of lowering your risk. So making changes that lower this value of taking driving pressure times 4 plus respiratory rate. And again, if you lower driving pressure, you're gonna have to increase respiratory rate. But keep in mind that lowering driving pressure, you're multiplying this by a factor of 4. So it has more of an impact to lower driving pressure. But is there a point at which lowering driving pressure actually provides no value whatsoever, and perhaps the increase in rate is harmful? And the answer is yes, and that's coming up on one of the next figures. So when they compared that simple variable of just measuring driving pressure and respiratory rate, and again, putting into this little equation here and using that as a guide as to whether or not you're increasing harm or decreasing harm when manipulating the ventilator, they found that it was much more significant in terms of its association with harm as what compared to the power. So, and again, can you use power? This doesn't say you shouldn't use power. It's just saying that you can use simpler variables to have the same predictive power of outcome. Right. So in terms of things you're trying to improve at the bedside, you can measure power and try to lower power any way you can, or you can use driving pressure and respiratory rate and do the same. So a lot of these graphs are going to say a lot of the same things that I'm going to show on some of the other graphs, but basically these are the quintiles of driving pressure. So they basically split them up into 5 different components here. And as you can expect, the higher the range of driving pressures are. So this is, we've got 8.5, and I believe in brackets, it's probably, it might be the standard deviation. Quintile. Actually, it might be the range if this is, let me just see, equal size samples, quintiles. Okay, adjust my time. I like when they label them a little better, but I'm looking for a legend and I don't see it as clearly. What time was plateau measured? I'm not sure. I'll have to look closely at it. And I think you're referring to like whether or not it was held too long or not. So the problem is, Ariel, this is taken from studies that measured plateau, but whether or not those studies specified, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds is questionable. You hope that overall you're going to get the results that you want. And if everybody did it the same, then you'd still have the same results. But the average driving pressure was 15 in the data set. So if the average driving pressure was really, really low in a study of ARDS patients, I'd be concerned that maybe everyone held the plateau pressure way too long because you'd get stress relaxation, leaks, et cetera, and you'd end up with very low values. But they had enough data to separate into quintiles of driving pressure. So they have quintiles of driving pressure, respiratory rate. So you can see driving pressure has much more of an impact. Respiratory rate also has an impact, but not as strong as the driving pressure. And this is standardized mortality ratio, standardized mortality ratio. So we're gonna have to see what the difference between A and B is, because they are essentially, there's driving pressure, respiratory rate, driving pressure, tidal volume, and then driving pressure and power. And you can see power also is associated at the higher levels of power, but driving pressure you can see has more relationship here. Let's see what A is. Okay, mortality. Each of these figures is adjusted for baseline risk model, driving pressure, and one of the following: respiratory rate, A, tidal volume, B. Okay, so yeah, it's just whether or not they are, they're adjusted for baseline risk model and one of the following. So they either are using a baseline of respiratory rate or a baseline of tidal volume. Again, these aren't the graphs that I think are the most useful to a clinician at the bedside. That one is coming up if you're ready for it. And so I find the isocapnic curves to the average clinician at the bedside. This isocapnic curve figure that I'm about to show you is probably the most beneficial visually for someone working clinically at the bedside in terms of what should I do? Should I focus on driving pressure or should I focus on respiratory rate? I believe this next figure is the figure that you need to consider, because this is great. You can look at this and go, oh, driving pressure is worse, respiratory rate's worse. Okay, great. I already showed you that with the forest plots. So I find this graph to be extremely useful. This is just another way of demonstrating it with using, again, the same adjustments, but comparing to respiratory rate and tidal volume, et cetera. But if you go down to here, this is the graphic right here that I like. So one of the things it's showing, it's looking the relative risk of death, and this is looking at driving pressure and respiratory rate. So again, when you're looking at odds ratio, 1 means there's no difference. So as it increases above 1, this is where you start to have an increased odds of poor outcome, such as mortality. So above 15, as similar to the driving pressure paper from Amato in 2015 in the New England Journal of Medicine, you can see at above 15, your risk increases, and driving pressure is the solid line here. So driving pressure, again, is 4 times higher than respiratory rate in terms of its impact. So driving pressure is here. And then respiratory rate, right around 25, getting above 25 is where it starts to go up. But as you can see, this is more of an exponential rise, whereas this is quite linear. I know there's a range that gets wider here, but the average is quite linear, where this is has a little bit of an upward curve to it. Now, this is the graphic that's probably most helpful. If a patient has very poor compliance, and this means that they have very stiff lungs and likely a high driving pressure. And here's an example, a driving pressure of 27. Now, we know higher than 15 is bad, but what if it's 27 and the best you can do is get it to 21? This is the graphic for you. And I'm sure since COVID-19 has hit our intensive care units, we've all seen driving pressures that are this crazy. So if your driving pressure was 27 and your respiratory rate was 30, increasing the respiratory rate to 45, if you just did that, you would increase the risk for harm, right? But if you did that in conjunction with lowering your driving pressure, so if you lowered your tidal volume, this little dot here lines up to about 5.5, maybe just over that in terms of mils per kilogram of predicted body weight. So we're not even at 6 mils per kilo yet. But if you lowered it to just above 4 mils per kilo, and you were able to get your driving pressure down just 6 centimeters of water, in order to maintain the same minute ventilation, again, these are isocapnic curves, meaning the resulting minute ventilation is the same. So by lowering the driving pressure just 6 centimeters of water, you would have to increase your rate by 15 from 30 up to 45. But what this graphic is showing you is that you have a reduction in your odds ratio of death. So you've lowered your risk by doing this. Now in the bottom example, this blue line, 35 mils per centimeter of water is, again, better compliance. And at the tidal volume of around 6, well, let's just say 6 mils per kilo because it's just above 6 mils per kilo of predicted body weight. The driving pressure is 12 and the respiratory rate's 25. So in this example, 12 is below 15, which we've been told is sort of the bad. And you can see here above 15 is bad, but this is below 15. So should we try to get the lowest driving pressure possible every time? Well, to do that, you'd have to lower your tidal volume. So if you lowered it to about 4.5 mils per kilo of predicted body weight, you would have to increase your rate to 40. So you get your driving pressure down to 9. You'd have to increase your rate to 40 breaths per minute in order to maintain minute ventilation. And by doing that, you can see the curve is going upwards. You're actually increasing the odds ratio rather than decreasing the odds ratio. So this is not a scenario in which it is beneficial to, again, try to get the lowest driving pressure possible by increasing respiratory rate and lowering tidal volume. It's just not necessary. And in fact, it could be potentially harmful. So it's not always the best to try and get, if we always wanted the lowest driving pressure, we would always be using between 4 and 5 mils per kilogram of predicted body weight and just cranking up the respiratory rate. But in someone with compliance of 35 mils per centimeter water, which isn't even super high, but it's not as bad as 14. The bottom line is if your driving pressure is 12, there's really no benefit in lowering it further and cranking up the respiratory rate because the risk, again, dropping your driving pressure by 3, but increasing your respiratory rate by 15 is not a positive trade-off, if that makes sense. So really that's where it comes down to the benefit of this paper, I think, is this graphic right here is very, very helpful, as well as the one, this graph here, which just sort of takes the different components, just so you know where the associations are in terms of harm. And then finally, when they get down to the discussion, their main findings are, one, that among ventilatory variables used in the computation of mechanical power, only the driving pressure and respiratory rate. Again, this is when looking at the independent variables, not mechanical power as a whole. But when you take the independent variables, driving pressure and respiratory rate were independently associated with survival, and the effect of driving pressure was not modified by the respiratory rate. These two variables together, readily available at the bedside, were comparable with mechanical power in terms of predicting mortality. So I'm definitely not saying you can't calculate mechanical power. You can. Bottom line is you can get the same outlook and understanding of what's going on with your patient by simply using two variables that are easily found at the bedside. So 3, mechanical power was independently associated with mortality, but this was mainly because of its dynamic elastic component, which is the driving pressure. And the greater impact of the driving pressure on mortality when compared with respiratory rate may have practical implications. Ventilatory strategies with higher respiratory rates associated with lower tidal volume can be beneficial for very sick patients in a trade-off that can be estimated, and we present a model for such estimation. So our findings of an association between mechanical power and survival was not unexpected. Power increases with increments in PEEP, driving pressure, tidal volume, respiratory rate, and peak, and there's a reference for that. Some of these variables are linked to disease severity. For example, more severe hypoxemia can lead clinicians to increase the PEEP. Consequently, patients in a more severe condition receive a higher PEEP, such that PEEP may be a marker of severity and may not necessarily be the cause of harm. Conversely, other components like the tidal volume and driving pressure are implicated in promoting ventilator-induced lung injury. Power is thus a composite of risk factors linked to underlying disease severity and modifiable factors that can cause lung injury, such as the tidal volume and respiratory rate as mediators. High power values could therefore have different interpretations. 1, severe underlying disease and adequate ventilator settings. 2, severe underlying disease and injurious ventilator settings, or simply 3, injurious ventilator settings. Recently, Zhang and then I won't go into all the other descriptions. Really, the first part of the description really I don't want to say fine tunes, but it tries to put the results and their findings into layman's terms. So whenever you're reading a paper, the discussion part, a lot of people will skip it because it doesn't add anything necessarily to the results of the paper, but it really is a nice way, usually starts off with explaining the results in layman's terms. And then it gets into usually comparing their results with other papers, which is helpful if you want to find more papers to read. This was another graph. This is just a mediational model showing the contribution of driving pressure and respiratory rate to mortality. So just saying, so if you have protective or conventional, increasing the respiratory rate by 2, you may increase your odds ratio this much. If you can drop your driving pressure by 2.72, you can reduce your odds ratio. So just considering the fact that dropping your driving pressure, even if you have to increase your rate, is probably the way to go. So let's see what Ariel's saying here. As we know, energy is needed to overcome the resistance of the ET tube, and it is flow dependent. It should be eliminated by using P trach instead of P airway. Yeah, the issue I have with using the resistive component of the power equation is that you can change that resistive value by changing your flow rate, but it doesn't mean that that's what's reaching the lungs, and that's your point. If the ventilator has a P trach waveform, it usually tries to eliminate the resistive pressure that it's either estimating or is measuring directly, and that's shown quite nicely again with this forest plot here, where the resistive power. So the way that these things are interpreted is they shouldn't cross one. Also, the wider the range is, the more the more it lacks confidence in the value. So the tighter it is, the more confident. That's basically a tighter confidence interval. Whereas here, there's not. It's pretty wide compared to the other values. So that's the paper. Let's go back up and look at what this contributes to the data to date, which I like those. I like these little summaries. Let me just blow it up here if I can. He adds to the field on the basis of an analysis of 4,549 patients from a pooled database of patients with ARDS. We found that among ventilator variables, only the driving pressure and respiratory rate had significant associations with mortality. Again, looking at the individual variables, not saying mortality is not associated with mechanical power, but when you break down the individual variables, driving pressure and respiratory rate had significant associations with mortality. These two variables combined, according to the formula, 4 times driving pressure plus respiratory rate, were at least as informative as mechanical power. Ventilatory strategies with the lower tidal volume and higher respiratory rates may be beneficial for patients with low respiratory system compliance. All right. So that is my article review. Do we have any questions? Oops. Looks like I had one person viewing from YouTube that made some random comment that is literally just 4 letters. I don't know what they're supposed to mean. It's V, capital V, capital O, little r, dot, little r, capital E, capital D. I have no idea what that means, but it looks like they're not viewing from YouTube anymore. Oh well. Maybe I'll put it on this graph here. Any other questions or comments? How are these patients assessed in their level of ARDS? So these were all patients that were enrolled into ARDS studies. So their level of ARDS, they would have been enrolled as per the criteria of the study. Most of the studies, if I'm not mistaken, included patients with ARDS that were, I'm trying to think, express if they were less than 300 or 200. I mean, all of them were either mild, moderate, or severe ARDS. Let me just quickly go back up and see if they excluded patients with certain PF ratios or not. I don't remember if they mentioned that they needed to or not. The nice thing is they adjusted for PF ratio. So this is important because obviously patients with a higher PF ratio are not going to have the same risk profile as those with low. So it was one of the confounding variables that they used in their models for adjusting. 4 trials. Yeah, I'd have to look up individually the trials to remember what their limits were. I'll All of them would have had PF ratios less than 300. Some of them may have only included those below 200. Even ones that included those below 300, the average was almost always below 200. No, there's no mention of how long they were on high flow or BiPAP prior to that. No, these are just patients who are enrolled in ARDS studies. And it's really not, to be honest, it's not really relevant to what they're showing, because if they're not explaining, they're not saying why people have poor compliance. It's just, if you have poor compliance, then lowering driving pressure and increasing respiratory rate is more beneficial than someone who has higher compliance, for example. So irregardless of how their lungs got that bad, this is just a matter of whether or not things like driving pressure or respiratory rate or mechanical power or PEEP are associated with poor outcomes. Yeah, if someone's on high FiO2, that reduces your FRC and obviously can be damaging to your lungs because you lose FRC. But it's sort of irrelevant to the model here. The question is whether or not those variables, which are driving pressure, respiratory rate, etc., are associated with poor outcomes. And if they are, then modifying them, what's the net gain and the net loss? So that's what that isocapnic curve helps to show. And again, this is not it's not a randomized controlled trial. This is just looking at retrospective data. So we don't know prospectively if you used driving pressure time or plus. So if you use this equation here and decided to make changes in order to reduce it all the time, this is not a randomized trial. So you would need data. We need prospective data. Most of us have been saying this since the driving pressure paper came out. Many papers have continued to show an association between driving pressure and poor outcomes. The question is, if you are to do everything you can do to lower driving pressure in a prospective study, is that going to be beneficial? We still need to know. We still need to study that. Ariel saying, is the energy the one to blame, or the increase in energy reflects that the lung is getting worse? I think that's what the one comment was in the paper, Ariel, is that it's a possibility that mechanical power. Let me just go back to that statement, because I think this addresses the question you just asked. But I may have read it too fast. Excuse me. Here we go. So here it's saying, here I'll start up here again. Power increases with increments in PEEP with all those variables that we discussed, but some of these variables are linked to disease severity. So for example, more severe hypoxemia can lead clinicians to increase PEEP. Consequently, patients in more severe conditions receive a higher PEEP, such that PEEP may be a marker of severity and may not necessarily be harmful. So it could just be how severe the patients are. So if your question is, does the energy reflect that the lung is getting worse, or just sort of like, is it the energy of the PEEP, or is it just the fact that the lungs are worse? So patients with higher severity may end up having higher PEEP, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the PEEP contributed to it. They just happen to be on higher PEEP because they're more severe already. So when we increase PEEP in someone who is more severe, they end up with higher PEEP, but obviously it didn't contribute to it because it was already there prior. So when they're looking back at this data, again, this is within the first 24 hours of them being enrolled in the study, but if they had already had a huge hit in lung injury, they may have ended up being on higher levels of PEEP. So again, that high level of PEEP may not have been the contributor to the harm, rather than a result of the fact that the level of harm and hypoxemia they had at the time of enrollment. They did control for study groups. So a lot of those studies were higher versus lower PEEP. So they did control for that, but it's still something that can't be completely eliminated. Because even in a low PEEP study, if you need high FiO2 because your lungs are that injured, you're going to end up on a higher level of PEEP in the PEEP table. And then, so it mentions here that high power values could therefore have different interpretations. Severe underlying disease and adequate ventilator settings. So perhaps the lungs were that bad and they're actually on the appropriate ventilator settings, but those ventilator settings end up having a high power component, but it's because of how severe their underlying disease is. Two, severe underlying disease and injurious ventilator settings. So obviously they have underlying disease that might be bad, but then the settings that we are applying are actually not appropriate for the patient. So therefore the high mechanical power would then be an additive effect rather than a supportive component. And then three, injurious, just three are just straight up injurious settings in a healthier lung. And that would obviously be a horrible scenario if you're just randomly assigning patients to the wrong ventilator settings. You're welcome, Liv. Any more questions? I have another question. Should I do more of these article reviews? Because it definitely gives me something to chat about. I sometimes not sure what I'm going to chat about when I come online. Ariel has a strong belief. Let's put it on the screen. Ariel has a strong belief that how much you strain the lung and how often counts, but mainly the flow profile, strain rate, and flow profile with the initial peak inspiratory flow could cause more damage in the lung due to its viscoelastic behavior. Do they mention flow profiles and volume control or pressure control? Not in this paper, no, but there is another paper looking at flow profiles recently. And I believe they were saying that a constant flow profile was less injurious. I could cover that paper in another live if you want. And it's because pressure control, essentially, there's no control over the peak inspiratory flow. It can actually be quite high. It's actually fascinating how high the peak pressure, how high the peak flow rate can be sometimes in pressure control and in pressure support. When you look at some of the peak inspiratory flows, they're insane. Melanie's saying, yes, love the article reviews. Okay. I could also ask, I mean, if anybody has a specific article that they want me to describe or go through, I'm happy to do that. If I haven't read the article, I'll read through it one or two times just so I know things that I want to point out. But otherwise, yeah, this can give me something to chat about. Yeah, I think the more we know about the physiological data that's coming that's coming through. Take care, Troy. The more we understand the physiological data that's out there, I think the more it informs our practice. But we do have to be cautious, though, because the physiological data, as interesting as it is, doesn't replace the need for prospective randomized control trials, right? So I can say, I mean, I can go clinically and say, you know what, I'm going to calculate driving pressure times 4 plus respiratory rate and then see how I reduce that value with this. I can do that myself clinically, but I don't know if that should be a generalized approach for everyone. So I have this paper to support that. I can tell myself that I feel better knowing that I lowered someone's tidal volume and increased their rate. But I don't know that should be written into a protocol, for example, because we don't have good prospective data that we should necessarily do that. But the physiology is there. I mean, this is just essentially saying like this is probably a good time to lower your driving pressure. If it's 27, you're not going to get it to 15, but if you can get it to 21 and increase your respiratory rate, these are rates that are crazy. But keep in mind that you might look at 45 and say, how could you ventilate somebody that fast without air trapping? And I mean, we're talking about a compliance of 14 mils per centimeter of water. I mean, you probably can get close to 40 or 45 without significant air trapping. Obviously dependent upon what eye time you're using, but with that, I mean, your volume is getting into that patient pretty darn quick. There's not a whole lot of compliance there. I don't necessarily agree that most old studies favor the decelerating. I mean, the ArdsNet studies were used volume control. We're talking like that data set's over 900 patients. The Love study, I believe, allowed either pressure control or volume control, but they didn't protocolize the mode in most of those studies. So I would have to see a study that you're referring to that favors descending ramps. Because I know that's one of the criticism of ArdsNet is people didn't like using volume control because peak pressures made them uncomfortable. But ArdsNet was volume AC. Before I leave, we've had to use 40 to 45 with no auto peep several times over the last few years. Yeah, some of these COVID patients, honestly, like this article was not written in response to COVID patients, nor did they use a database. And again, this is just a mathematical model. Like this is not the patient data. This is just a model, right? But even in this model, when you see driving pressure at 27 and 21, it seems crazy knowing that 15 is bad. But man, we've all seen these driving pressures in the last couple of years with COVID for sure. Yeah, I mean, auto flow just makes your constant flow decelerating, and I personally I'm fine with constant flow. The issue with constant flow is that your peak pressures will be higher, so you have to measure plateau pressure more often. And you can actually set up your ventilator to do that properly. So I think Ariel is agreeing that perhaps we should use constant flow. So auto flow turns your volume control into decelerating flow, and technically he's just saying you lose the ability of looking at the stress index. Now, the cautionary tale with the stress index is that if your flow is set appropriately in an adult patient, like closer to 50, 60 liters per minute, the stress index is not accurate. You do have to lower your flow rate to get a accurate measure of your stress index, something closer to 30 liters per minute of flow while you're doing your measurement would be sufficient or best. And so if you are using constant flow, you do need to measure plateau pressure more routinely. And that's where this, so let yeah, this really turns your ventilator into a monitoring beast, in my humble opinion. And the question, is that enough time to get the plateau reading? Ariel, I'll let you answer that. I've been saying this I've been saying this a long time, but let's not just take my opinion. So the answer is yes. Ideally, you want less than 0.5 seconds. Ideally. So the ideal time is less than 0.5 seconds. Typically, we set 0.2 or 0.3 second pause. The problem is when you take too long of an inspiratory pause, there's a couple of different scenarios that can cause your plateau pressure to fall over time. One of them is stress relaxation, which just happens to be because of the viscoelastic properties of the lung. Volume can shift within the lungs, but it doesn't reflect what the lung feels at peak inspiration. If you wait too long, the pressure actually shifts, and we'll demonstrate something that is showing after the volume has sort of moved around, sort of like a pendulum sort of idea. The other problem is that when you do an inspiratory pause, the pressures in the ventilator are often higher than your cuff pressure. So you could have a very small leak around the cuff that's not audible. Sometimes you can hear it when you do it, but sometimes you may not hear it, and it may be so subtle that you don't notice, but you'll see the pressure dropping over time. So you really want to see the highest stress point of the breath, which is at a very short pause. There's actually a good paper. I believe it is. Let's see. Here it is. Hold on. All right. Let me change my screen here. Stop sharing that one. I'll share a different. I'll share a different one here. Yeah. So this paper here, 50 years of research in ARDS. Um, this also has some my colleagues here. Lou did a live with me a little while ago. He's the one that does the recruitment to inflation ratio paper, and then Marcelo's here, and Laurent Bouchard is there as well. And when you look down here, there's a nice little graph somewhere. Where is it? Here we go. This is the graph. So ideally, you want less than 0.5 seconds. This is just a good. So here it says preferential use of a short inspiratory pause, less than or equal to 0.5 seconds is ideal because you can have this stress relaxation. So what the lung feels is here at P1, and down here does not represent what the lung felt at the peak inspiration. So you really want that alveolar pressure to be represented rather than something lower than that. So the longer you hold, the less you want to do it. Yeah. So respiratory educators are not always up on the most recent data sometimes. I personally used to protocolize, I think, 3-second pauses. So we're all guilty of it. It's just whether or not we keep up on the data. This paper, for example, was very helpful for a lot of people. It was published in 2017, and it kind of, if respiratory educators, I mean, this is a good paper for respiratory educators because it talks about how transpulmonary pressure is measured, the different components, elastance derived versus directly measured. There's all kinds of good stuff in here, but this is probably the most useful for the average bedside clinician is this graphic right here. Now, Ariel's saying sometimes it's hard to be measured because the P is still somewhat not very stable. So yeah, the the other time that it's really not stable, if you have someone with really high airway resistance, like you have like an asthma patient or a COPD patient, it is sometimes extremely hard to get a nice stable plateau pressure. Like you are not airway obstruction. An educator that is not up to date should resign. Yeah. I'll let Ariel say that, not me. But yeah, I really think it is the response. If your job is to be a clinical educator, you have to be a little bit, maybe not obsessed, but you got to be very interested in what the recent data is. Not even recent. This isn't really recent data, but just really understanding what the recommendations are for performing the things that you are requiring staff to do, for example. Any other questions or comments? I'm glad I sorted out the audio issue. I feel bad that I was having audio issues early on. How can you see this paper? The one that's on my screen right now, I would just search for respiratory mechanics in acute respiratory distress syndrome. The first author is Henderson. I don't know if this one is open access. Let me check. I need to not click that link because if I click that link, it's going to log in with my proxy, and you don't want it. I know I can have access with my proxy. Let's see if you can have access. So if I go to the site and I click PDF, let's see what happens. Yes, it is open access. So you will be able to get it. I will drop this into the chat right now. There you go. That'll go. That should go right to the PDF. I will be very close to you guys in Canada, so might be able to visit Toronto. Uh-oh. I'm not in Toronto though anymore, Ariel. I'm like 2.5 hours away from Toronto now. Someone's saying it's hard to blame the teacher because some things you learn are for book test and what you actually do in the field. Yeah, at the same time, I mean, we're not I don't think we mean educators as in college. I think we're referring to, and maybe Liv can clarify, but I think she means clinical educator like in the hospital. And clinical educators don't have the same excuses as the textbook educators in the college. The textbook educators, it would be nice if they understood as well, but they're supposed to teach you the basics, right? Like the base knowledge. People, yeah. So Liv meant the educator at work. So people that are clinical educators really should be up on clinical practice because that changes um, quite drastically. And it's way different than the baseline knowledge that we're supposed to obtain in school. I mean, I do agree that the schools should, maintain what the most recent data is, but I think they're held to a lesser standard when it comes down to clinical education, where you're actually instructing your staff on new things to do with patients. Oh, are you coming to the mechanical ventilation symposium in April, Ariel? So I've been participating in that since 2016, but I have not received an email yet. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm faculty this year or not. I just assume I am because I have been for the last 6 years, but maybe they're switching things out. I have no idea. I guess I could email somebody and ask them what's up, but they haven't announced the program yet. So I'm not too worried yet. Hopefully I get to be involved again. It's always fun. Are you going to be in Buffalo, Ariel? Is that where you're going to be? Like, where are you going to be that's close to Canada? No, that is not the one I have a debate. Liv saying, is that the one I have a debate? No, that's the AARC conference. That's in New Orleans. The Mechanical Ventilation Symposium is here in Canada. It happens every year. It's been remote for the last couple of years because of COVID. I think this year it might be a joint thing. Cleveland. No, I think Cleveland's still a bit of a trek to Canada. Let me look. So mechanical ventilation, ca. All right. This is I will post it in the Facebook chat. Here we go. So the mechanical ventilation course, yeah, I don't think they've posted so usually there's a faculty page and it has all of us on there, but they have not put the faculty page, so they might still be figuring that out. But for respiratory therapists, it is $350 virtual or $800 in person. And it's a 3-day course. Includes late breakfast and lunch on each day, obviously if you're in person. If I said it, I'd be biased, so I'll put you on the screen, Ariel. If you're referring to price, it's no different. It's just if you're a respiratory therapist, this is your price. Doesn't matter where you come from. We had 2 years ago, no, 3. I guess the last time it was in person would have been 2019, and there was a few people from like California, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There's always quite a few people from the states that come. There's there's so much stuff like between like France, Italy, and Toronto. I'd say Canada, but most of the stuff, um, there's some good stuff coming out of Canada, but Toronto seems to be like a hub of mechanical ventilation research with Eddie Fan, Ewan Gallagher, Laurent Burchard, um, Neil Ferguson, Maureen Mead, um, Deborah Cook. Now I know Maureen Mead and Deborah Cook haven't published a lot in the mechanical ventilation space, but they have been involved in many of the mechanical ventilation studies that have come out of Canada. Particularly, those two are involved in the larger randomized trials. Like Love Study was a big one. Deborah Cook was involved in the EP Vent 2 as well, because I was at that site. We were one of the participating centers. But in terms of like physiology, Brian Kavanaugh's lab that included like Bhushan Katira, and right now Felipe Damiani is there doing more research. He's back in Toronto doing more research there. Unfortunately, Brian Kavanaugh passed away. I think it's been 2 years now. How can someone get involved at their hospital? You have to get a job there. So Toronto General Hospital, St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. That's where a lot of the respiratory research is going on now. Yeah, have you checked your area, Liv? I can't remember where you're practicing right now. I don't know if you checked the area. Ariel's saying, do they have programs for foreign professionals like visitations? There's quite a few people that come for like research electives, but it's typically arranged through their university or yeah, I'm not sure how that works. Like I know Felipe's up there because he's a professor at a university in Chile, and I think they arrange some clinical time because usually it's involved in some sort of either a master's or a PhD, and they're there for the purpose of doing research. Unfortunately, depending on the timing you get there, it may not be in a very exciting time for research. It really just depends on what's going on. But if you're there long enough, then you're usually asked to sort of come up with your own project. But then the chances of it getting through ethics, et cetera, it's very time sensitive. So depending on what your purpose for coming up for, like, for example, when Felipe came up, he mostly focused on animal research, and he was able to get a lot of his work done in that time because it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier at animal research, ethics, and in terms of like enrolling patients, you just have to obtain the animal models, whereas patient studies are a little bit more complicated. You're in Phoenix right now. Okay. Yeah, I don't know anyone specific from Phoenix, but you could try looking. I don't know if there's any message boards for the um, the associations in Arizona for RT, but it might be worth throwing a call out on any of the Facebook pages for RTs. I imagine somewhere in Arizona might be doing some form of research. Whether or not they're doing like really cool physiology research is questionable, but you never know. Any more questions or comments? Yeah, positions for research are not very abundant in respiratory care. There are some, like I know, for example, when I was in Toronto, a respiratory therapy student from Quebec asked if he could come and spend. Can't remember how long he asked to come. It was at least a couple months. He actually wrote a paper on his experience, and he was able to come and participate in the lab. He wasn't expected to come up with a large research project. He was there kind of essentially volunteering, so he had to do it on his own pay. So I guess the difference is if you plan on coming to Toronto to do research and hope to have some sort of funding to be there, that's typically arranged through universities, yes. But if you want to just come on your own, spend your own money, find your own place to stay, that kind of stuff, then that can usually be arranged. They just have to make sure that you get security clearance and a name badge so you can get into the hospital, and that can be done through Dr. Bouchard. Again, I don't know if they've opened it up right now. They probably will shortly, but that's been an issue with the pandemic in terms of having people come, but that may change now. Yeah, Rob's a smart guy. He's a good one. He's got a nice little research setup there. But I think let me see if I can find. Well, I'll just search my own name in my database because I know it's one of the. Here we go. The impact of a research elective on research on a respiratory therapy student's perspective. Sorry. So this study was published by a colleague, Nikolai Moros. He's a RT. He's no longer a student RT. He's actually a staff RT, and he's an MD originally from Russia who moved to Canada. And he wrote this paper on his experience um, coming to Toronto. Nice little write up. I'll send the link for this as well. That's crazy. The travel contracts. That's insane. And that's American, isn't it? That amount. Yes, they will post the course outline. They normally have the they normally have it up. Um I'm surprised they don't have it up yet. I was just pointing that out earlier that I don't know. I'm not sure I'm involved this year because I haven't been contacted yet. So I've done it for 6 years. I mean, if they're trying to get some new blood in there, I would totally understand. But um, the fact that there's no um, program up yet, um, I'm not sure what's going on. I guess I could email one of them to find out if I'm on the faculty this year. they might be trying to figure out who they're going to, because it's also being done online. So there's probably a lot of logistics because people can register from online. So usually when there's in person, there's a lot of hands-on stuff. So they might be trying to figure out what they're going to do for the people that can't be there for hands-on. Like, are they going to stream it, or are they going to provide other presentations or workshops online? Um, it's a good question. I'm not sure how they're going to handle it. As high as 6,000 for 48 hours a week at one point. Jeez, that's crazy. That's an easy way to make some money. I know travel nursing is huge too because they don't pay nurses well enough for most places to stick around when they can make so much more money traveling. And I guess there's a lot of RTs that want to do that too. You're welcome, Maria. Any more questions or comments? Do it more often, but announce it first. Should I schedule it? Because I can schedule them and it'll make a Facebook post with a schedule. Does anyone have any requests? What was the paper I said I could do next time? I think what was I already forget what paper I said I would do. Let me go back through my comments. I don't need to ask you guys. Well, maybe I didn't. Actually, might not be in the comments. I may have just said it. Oh, it was the flow profile one. I was saying I could do the flow profile one. I might do another one that's a bit more clinically relevant. There's one that you know what? If you look back at the discussion I had with you and Gallagher on respiratory drive, I briefly mentioned a paper that there was one online ahead of print. And so this one here, I might do this one next. The effect of lowering tidal volume on mortality in acute respiratory distress syndrome varies with respiratory system elastance. I think I'll do this one. This is another very clinically interesting paper. Again, same caveat. We don't know if using this information prospectively saves lives. So, when I present these papers, even the one from today, it doesn't mean that that's how we should all be moving forward. But it's definitely something that we can at least look at and understand, perhaps what the risk profile is for our patient. But whether or not, obsessing over that risk profile and making changes accordingly, whether or not that's what we need to do, needs further data. But this would be a good one I can do. Oh, post the paper in advance. Okay, well, I could do both. I could post a link, and I think I did that with Bhushan when I brought Bhushan Katira on. I think we posted a link to his paper before when I scheduled it, as well as Lu Chen. I posted a link to the recruitment to inflation ratio paper. And for anyone that's used my online calculator, I just finished the new version of the online calculator, which allows you to create an account and save information and use like a more robust form. And then you can save it and you can print off a PDF if you want. But the only thing I want to add is the ability to export all of the data you save as an Excel spreadsheet if you want to collect all of the data after using it for a while. And I can give a demo for that, the calculator, once it's totally ready. I've been live streaming me coding it in the last few days, not always on Facebook, sometimes just on Twitch. All right, so that's what I'll do. I'll post, we'll do this paper next, and I'll post a link and I'll schedule it. I'll look at my calendar. I'll probably do another one this week just because I don't have to work this week. I have the week off. And this is a good one. Another one with some good graphs. And actually, I've already made a blog post on this paper. So you could also pre-read the blog post, which is comv.ca. I can throw that up in the ticker. There's a blog post on that website. All right, well, if nobody has any more comments or questions, if no one wants to keep me on by making me talk about stuff, then I will sign off. And this will be the next paper. All right, I see no comments or questions coming through. You're welcome, Melanie. All right, hope to talk to you guys soon. Have a great night.